Hi, my name is Brooke. Today I'm going to be showing you how to do a few different watercolor techniques that might help you if you're interested in painting the foliage around you or things in your home. These are just a few really fun techniques that you can do really easily with some basic watercolors and some things around your house. So to get started, I have some paper here. So I just have some regular computer paper. If that's all you have, that's totally fine. I have two pieces of paper back to back just to help with the bleeding a little bit since the paper is so thin. If you have some watercolor paper, it's a little bit thicker, so that's always helpful. Or really any other thick paper that will work a little bit better for you, like cardstock or something like that. But really whatever you have on hand is great. So I have some paper, I have my watercolors. Now you might be more familiar, or you might have on hand the rectangle sets of watercolors with the different colors on each side. Totally fine, whatever you have is great. These just happen to be the ones I have on hand and they work the same exact way. And then I have some water. I just have two things of water to save myself some trips going to change my water. And then just a paper towel, a rag, which they do the same thing. I just have both handy, and some paintbrushes. And then I also picked up a few other things that I'll mention in a bit, but some plastic wrap and some table salt. So to get started, I'm going to show you a few different techniques just on this paper that might be helpful if you're painting plants or flowers or trees, water, really anything. It's just a really fun way to paint. So to get started, I'm going to take one of my bigger brushes that I have. This happens to be the biggest one I have, but if you have a bigger one, that's great. And you just get it wet in your water. And we're going to be doing a technique called wet on wet. So that means that you need to get your paper wet, and then we're going to be working with wet paint. So I'll show you what I mean by that in just a moment. So I'm going to wet my paper first. Another thing that's helpful when working with watercolor, because you're using so much water and it can warp your paper, which means it can make it so you can see already how this one's warping because it's so thin. If you have any painter's tape or masking tape, you can always tape the edges of your paper very gently onto your table or another flat surface, and that will help keep your paper flat and from warping as badly as it might. So, okay, I've got my paper wet, and now we're going to be working with wet paint. So that means I'm going to pick a watercolor. I'm going to get some water on it. So let's do, how about some blue? So I'm going to dip that. I'm just going to bring in here so I can see what kind of color I have. I'm going to grab some more water and put that in there to water it down a bit. So I'm taking my watercolor, I'm getting it wet so it's really runny. And then I'm gonna brush that right on top of my wet base layer on my paper. So you'll see that it's really bleeding and fading. This is a really nice technique for a lot of different things, but some things that come to mind first are like if you're painting the sky or if you're painting water, anything like that you might want more of a faded effect. This is a great technique for that. And if you have a pen on hand, let's see if I have one. You can also label these if you're curious as you go along, so you can remind yourself what exactly that technique was. All right, so moving on, we're going to be doing a similar but a little bit different technique. So this one is called dry on wet. So I'm going to wet my paper again. Doesn't have to be perfect, just for practicing. All right, so I've got my paper wet, and now I'm gonna dry off my brush, or I'll grab another one that's dry, and I'm gonna dip it into my watercolor without putting any more water on my brush. So wet paper, and then using just your lightly damp brush to pick up the paint without getting any more water on your brush. And then I'm gonna draw and paint whatever design I want. So you'll see the difference between the two. We used a wet background for both, but this one's a lot more blended and kind of the color's more dispersed and faded, whereas this one you can still see your shapes and your lines, but just the edges are kind of bleeding out a little bit. to make it slightly softer. So again, this is the dry on wet technique. The cool thing about these techniques is you can always layer them. So I can let these dry and then come back in with similar or different techniques to build upon whatever I've started. So that's pretty neat. So then from here I can go and label this one dry on wet. And then the last technique I want to talk about that's a little bit different than these two is just dry on dry. So I'm going to take a brush. I'm not going to wet my paper. I'm not going to get my brush any more wet, and I'm going to dip it in the color. So it's going to be a lot more pigmented because I don't have water kind of running the color down a little bit. So from here I can just paint on my color. And you'll see that my lines or my designs are a lot more defined. You can see a lot more of the individual brush strokes, a lot more of the individual, excuse me, bristles in your brush. So this is great for detail or anything like that where you want to define exactly what you're doing. So again, if you imagine layering these on top of one another, you can make a really nice picture using these different techniques. So again, this one is called dry on dry. All right. Now, a couple other fun things I wanted to point out and show you is that using these techniques, you can use a few other household items to kind of enhance them, if you will, or make them a little bit better. So we're going to use this wet on wet technique a few times, and I'll show you what I mean. So I'm going to go ahead and use this bottom right hand corner of my page, and we'll do a few different techniques here with the wet on wet technique. So I'm going to get this pretty large. All right, so I've got my base layers all water, so my paper's all wet. And now I'm gonna do the same technique that we did up here, so wet on wet. So I'm gonna pick a color. We'll just stick with our blue again. Gonna bring that all through here, wet on wet, so it's gonna kind of bleed all over the place, and that's okay. Color's kind of gonna blend together. So I'm just gonna add the color everywhere and bring in some more water to keep my paper wet. All right. So from here, I can use a few of my household items. So I can use table salt. So I just have some salt in here. If you have more coarse salt, you can, you can experiment with more coarse salt. I just happen to have kind of this table salt here, so it's pretty light. This is a little bit messy, so you might want to make sure it's okay or that you're in a good space to practice this technique. But when you use the salt technique, you will want to let the salt dry on your paper. And then after your whole paper is dry, you can just pick this up, and let me see if I have an example. Well, it's not a great example, but that's okay. You can pick this up. I tore my paper a little bit because it's so thin, but you can pick it up and just cup your paper and then dump the salt into the trash. And it will leave, it's kind of hard to see, but a nice speckled look. The thicker your paper, the better these techniques will work, but you can kind of see through here the speckled look that gave. The other option is, let me see if there's any other examples. Not really, that's okay. The other option, using the same wet on wet technique, so if I use the bottom half of this page, again, the thicker your paper, the easier these techniques kind of work, but that's okay. It's still fun to experiment and see how they turn out on your own. Then you can take your saran wrap or your plastic wrap or whatever you have, plastic bag maybe, and you can lay it on top and bunch this up however you want. And then you can let, however you have this kind of scrunched up in the design you have, then you can just set this to the side and let it dry. And once it dries, the paint will get pushed around. As long as it's the wet on wet technique and there's enough water and paint under there still, it will dry in the pattern of your plastic wrap. So that's really always a neat way to kind of add an additional design and add depth onto your painting. So here are a few techniques that you can use. Another couple things that I don't have on hand, but maybe you have on hand. You can use stickers, crayons. You can experiment with types of glue. Sometimes those work depending on what type of paper you have. Now for computer paper, the glue might not be a great option, but you can still try crayons and stickers. And basically you'll want to draw your crayon design first or put your stickers on first. And then you can watercolor on top of those things and see how the paint reacts to the crayon. And then see after your paper dries, you can gently peel up the stickers to see what type of design those left on your page. So thanks so much. I hope that you learned something today. One other thing actually that might be helpful to show you kind of how you can combine techniques. So let's say I bring in this blue color and I do this dry on dry technique. I bring my line and I kind of let this dry for a second, and then I say, oh, that's actually a lot harsher than I wanted it to be. You can rinse your brush off and then bring the water, and you can soften these lines by putting some water next to it, and you'll see that it's slowly bringing this pigment out. So you can soften the lines and kind of bring that out. So I encourage you to experiment a little bit with what you have on hand to see how these techniques you can work, how you can use these techniques together to kind of make a really nice picture. And if you have an old rag or paper towel or old napkin handy, you can use that also to see how it will pull up or create a design if you blot it over your wet paint. So thanks so much for tuning in. I hope you learned something today. And next I'll be teaching you how you can apply some of these techniques to paint some things that you see around you, like spring leaves and flowers and things like that. Thanks so much for joining.